I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There she was, my wife of 17 years, on her knees in the middle of the company party, with her boss, Arthur. They acted as though no one else existed, as though the world around them had disappeared. My heart stopped, and in that instant, everything I thought I understood about my life was obliterated. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the public humiliation. I knew I had to act, but before diving deeper into this shocking story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. And if you enjoy gripping stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. Greg was in the middle of a routine meeting at the station when his phone vibrated on the desk. Glancing at the screen, he saw it was from Lenny's daycare. His stomach tightened. Calls from daycare were rarely good news. Excusing himself quickly, he answered, doing his best to keep his tone steady. "This is Johnson." The daycare principal's concerned voice came through. "Mr. Johnson, Lenny had a little accident on the playground. She's all right, but shaken up. We've been trying to contact Caroline all day, but we haven't been able to get through. Can you come pick her up?" "Of course," Greg replied, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. "I'm on my way." As he grabbed his keys and rushed to his car, a nagging unease grew. Caroline hadn't answered. She was usually glued to her phone, juggling emails and texts. Why wouldn't she respond, especially when it involved their daughter? The drive to daycare felt endless, with traffic crawling as Greg's mind raced. He replayed recent months, missed calls, distracted behavior, and broken promises. Caroline had assured him she would be more present for the kids. Where was she now? When he arrived, he found Lenny sitting on a bench in the office, clutching an ice pack against her knee. Her face lit up as soon as she saw him. "Daddy!" she cried, her eyes still glistening with tears. Greg crouched down, scooping her into his arms. "I'm here, sweetheart," he reassured her gently. The daycare principal approached, her expression apologetic. "She tripped during recess and skinned her knee. It was a bit nasty, but we cleaned it up. We tried Caroline's number multiple times, but..." Greg managed a polite nod. "Thank you for calling me. I'll take her to the doctor, just in case." Lenny clung to him as he carried her to the car. Once he had her buckled into the booster seat, she asked innocently, "Where's Mommy?" The question hit harder than he expected. "Mommy's busy with work," he said softly, though he couldn't ignore the doubt creeping in. Later, at the urgent care clinic, Greg tried calling Caroline again. The phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. He left a message, his tone controlled but firm. "Caroline, it's Greg. Lenny got hurt at daycare, and I couldn't reach you. We're at urgent care now. Call me as soon as you get this." Hours passed, but there was no response. Frustration simmered beneath Greg's calm exterior as he distracted Lenny with jokes and cartoons. By the time they returned home, it was nearing dinner. Caroline's car was absent from the driveway. Greg prepared a quick meal for Lenny and let her nap on the couch. He checked his phone again, still nothing. When Caroline finally walked through the door, she carried a shopping bag and looked completely unbothered. "Hey," she said casually, setting the bag on the counter. "What's up?" Greg stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face. "What's up?" "Lenny got hurt today, and the daycare couldn't reach you. I've been calling you for hours." Caroline froze for a moment before waving dismissively. "Oh, I must have left my phone in the car. What happened? Is she okay?" "She's fine now," Greg replied, his voice tight. "But she was scared and needed you. I needed you." Caroline avoided his gaze, busying herself with unpacking her bag. "I'm sorry, Greg. It won't happen again," she said, her tone flat, lacking sincerity. A flicker of doubt sparked in Greg's mind, a doubt he could no longer ignore. That evening, as the kids slept and the house fell silent, Greg sat alone in the living room. His mind churned with questions, images from the day playing on a loop. "She used to be my partner in everything," he thought bitterly, gripping his phone. "When did she become someone I couldn't depend on?" The incident with Lenny lingered like a shadow, planting seeds of suspicion. Caroline's excuse about her phone felt flimsy, almost rehearsed. Greg decided to trust his instincts and dig deeper. One evening, while Caroline was upstairs preparing for a business trip, Greg sat at the dining table, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. On impulse, He opened the location tracking app they had installed years ago for safety. It was rarely used, but tonight he felt compelled. Her phone's location didn't show their home. It pinged at the Holiday Inn on the edge of town. Greg's heart raced. Why would she be there at nearly 10 p.m.? His thoughts spun, trying to rationalize the situation, but suspicion wrapped around him like a vice. Unable to resist, he grabbed his jacket and keys. The drive to the hotel was tense, each mile fraught with questions he wasn't ready to face. He told himself it could be an innocent work meeting, but deep down he feared the worst. At the hotel, Greg parked in a dark corner, his pulse pounding as he spotted Caroline's car. Minutes later, the hotel door slid open. Greg's breath caught as Caroline emerged, laughing softly, her arm entwined with her boss, Arthur. Their body language erased any illusions. It wasn't a business meeting. Greg watched in stunned silence as Caroline leaned in and kissed Arthur. The kiss was intimate, lingering, full of affection Greg hadn't seen from her in years. Fury and heartbreak collided in his chest. Trembling, Greg pulled out his phone and took several photos, documenting the moment. He hated himself for it, but he needed proof that he wasn't imagining things. As they drove away in separate cars, Greg sat in the dark parking lot, staring at the photos on his phone. Each image cut deep, confirming a betrayal he could no longer deny. When he returned home, the house was silent. Caroline was already in bed, her back turned. As Greg stared at her sleeping form, his mind swirled with questions. How long has this been going on? And why? The confrontation would come, but not tonight. Tonight, he needed time to prepare for the storm ahead. The tension in the room grew heavier, but Greg chose not to press further. Instead, he let the silence linger, observing how she fidgeted nervously with her bag and how her smile failed to reach her eyes. Finally, Caroline broke the silence, her voice unnaturally chipper. Well, I should get going. Busy day ahead. Greg gave a neutral nod. Of course, don't let me hold you up. As the door clicked shut behind her, Greg exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Her evasive reactions and refusal to meet his gaze all but confirmed his suspicions. She wasn't just hiding something. She was concealing everything. Later that evening, Greg decided to probe her further. Over dinner, he casually brought up a harmless topic. How's Arthur doing? Haven't seen him around much lately. Caroline paused mid-bite, her fork clattering softly against the plate. Arthur? He's fine, I guess. Why do you ask? Greg shrugged, keeping his tone light. No particular reason, just curious. You work with him a lot, don't you? Her smile reappeared, but it seemed more forced this time. Sometimes, but not so much recently. He's been busy with other projects. Greg nodded thoughtfully, his face unreadable. That's good. I've heard he's a pretty ambitious guy. Caroline laughed, the sound too loud and quick to be genuine. Oh, he is, but you know, just work stuff, nothing exciting. Her unease was evident, and Greg let the subject drop. The awkward silence that followed was broken only by their children's chatter, their lively voices filling the room with carefree energy. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Greg kept a watchful eye on Caroline from the corner of the room. Illuminated by the glow of her phone, she scrolled intently, her expression unreadable. Greg's mind raced. Who was she texting? What stories was she weaving now? But he held his tongue, biding his time. When she finally set her phone down and slid under the covers, Greg made his move. Hey, he said quietly, his voice steady. Are you happy? The question startled her, and she hesitated before replying, her tone cautious. Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be? Greg shrugged, staring at the ceiling. I don't know. You've just seemed distracted lately. She shifted uncomfortably, her response guarded. Work's been stressful, that's all. Things will settle down soon. Greg turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. I hope so. For the kid's sake. Her jaw tightened, and without another word she rolled over, pulling the blanket up to her shoulder. Good night, Greg, she said softly. Good night, he replied, though sleep was the farthest thing from his mind. As Caroline's breathing evened out, Greg lay awake, staring into the darkness. Her answers felt rehearsed, her explanations too thin. He couldn't confront her yet, not without more proof. For now he played the role of the oblivious husband, though inside the fire of betrayal burned brighter, fueling his resolve to uncover the whole truth. In the days that followed, Greg felt a newfound determination. While Caroline carried on as though nothing was amiss, Greg began piecing together the truth. He couldn't rely on guesswork. He needed undeniable proof. The only way forward was to dig deeper. The first step was installing cameras. Late one night, after Caroline had fallen asleep, Greg quietly moved through the house, placing discrete devices in key locations: the living room, the kitchen, and even her car. Each camera was carefully positioned to avoid detection, but would provide clear footage of her actions and interactions. As he worked, guilt crept into his mind. This wasn't who he used to be, the trusting husband who believed in open communication. But that man had been blindsided. Shaking off the thought, Greg focused on his goal. "I deserve the truth," he reminded himself, "and so do the kids." The next step was accessing her emails. Using skills he'd honed during his years on the force, Greg bypassed Caroline's password protections one evening while she was out. As he scrolled through her inbox, his heart raced. Most messages seemed harmless: work memos, receipts, newsletters. But then he found them. The first email from Arthur was casual but laced with subtle intimacy. "Can't stop thinking about last night. You looked incredible. When can I see you again?" Greg's jaw clenched as he opened more messages. There were hotel confirmations, love notes, and even photos, snapshots of Caroline and Arthur looking carefree, happy, and entirely at ease. Each email was like a dagger to his heart, threading a web of deception that spanned years. The affair hadn't been a fleeting mistake. It was deliberate and prolonged, stretching back 6 years. While Greg had been working to build a life he thought they shared, she had been living a double life. The final piece of the puzzle came from her phone records. Accessing their shared account, Greg combed through months of call logs. Arthur's number appeared repeatedly, often during times Caroline had claimed to be working late or traveling. The pattern was undeniable. Sitting alone in the dim light of his computer screen, Greg felt the full weight of his discovery. The woman he had trusted and built a family with had betrayed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just the affair. It was the ease with which she lied. To him and to their children. Over the following weeks, the cameras revealed even more. Caroline's phone calls were hushed, her smile coy as she thought she was alone. But the footage from her car was the most damning. One afternoon, Greg watched as Arthur climbed into the passenger seat. They laughed, talked, and then Caroline leaned over to kiss him. A moment Greg knew he would never forget, no matter how much he wished he could. Amid the anger, Greg felt an overwhelming sadness. He replayed memories of family vacations, anniversaries, and the births of their children. Had any of it been real to her, he wondered, or had she always been living a separate life? One night, as he reviewed the growing collection of evidence, Greg broke down. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of betrayal finally crashing down on him. For years, he had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, to give Caroline and their children everything they needed. And this was how she repaid him. Eventually, Greg wiped his tears and refocused. There was no room for self-pity. He had to protect his children. Caroline's actions had already caused enough damage, but he wouldn't let her lies destroy their stability. With the evidence compiled, Greg felt a grim clarity. The time for second-guessing was over. Now, he had to confront her on his terms, not just for himself, but for their kids' future. In the days following Greg's revelation, an unspoken weight settled over the household. He tried to maintain an air of normalcy, but the tension between him and Caroline was palpable. Caroline, oblivious to just how much Greg had uncovered, appeared determined to continue her facade, yet her interactions with him were clipped and guarded. For Marissa and Junior, the shift in their parents' dynamic didn't go unnoticed. At 16, Marissa had always been insightful, and Junior, though quieter, was equally perceptive of the subtle changes in the air. One evening after dinner, Marissa cornered Greg in the living room, her arms crossed and her expression sharp. "Dad," she began, her voice low enough to avoid drawing her siblings' attention. "What's going on with you and Mom?" Greg looked up from his laptop, startled by her bluntness. "What do you mean?" he asked, attempting to deflect. Marissa raised an eyebrow, her gaze unrelenting. "Don't play dumb. You two barely talk anymore. She's always distracted, and you've been acting different." Greg sighed, closing the laptop and setting it aside. Marissa, sometimes adults go through things. It doesn't mean something terrible is happening. It's just complicated. Her frown deepened and she asked, "You're not getting a divorce, are you?" The question hit Greg harder than he'd anticipated. Taking a deep breath, he chose his words carefully. "Sweetheart, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you and your siblings. That will never change." Marissa studied him intently, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press further. "I just don't want us to fall apart," she murmured. Greg pulled her into a hug. "We won't," he promised softly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, it was Junior who approached him. Catching Greg as he brewed his coffee, the 12-year-old leaned against the counter, his tone hesitant. "Dad," he said quietly, "Marissa's been saying stuff about you and Mom." Greg turned to face him, his heart sinking. "What kind of stuff?" Junior shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "Just that maybe you're mad at her, that something's wrong." Greg crouched down, meeting his son's eyes. "Listen, Junior, sometimes grown-ups have problems, but that doesn't mean we don't love you and your sisters, okay?" Junior hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I just want everyone to be happy." Greg smiled faintly, ruffling his hair. "We're going to be fine. I promise." That evening, as the kids laughed together over a board game, Greg watched from the kitchen, his heart heavy but resolute. No matter what lay ahead, he would shield them from the storm. For now, the truth could wait. They needed to feel loved and safe. The confrontation began on a quiet Saturday evening. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, leaving the house unusually still. Greg had spent the day bracing himself, reviewing the evidence and rehearsing his words. Tonight, the charade would end. Carolyn sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in hand. Greg entered the living room, carrying a folder. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. When he sat across from her, she glanced up, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What's with the serious look?" she asked with a nervous laugh. Greg didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Caroline's smile faded. "About what?" One by one, Greg laid out the photos he had taken of her and Arthur at the Holiday Inn. Each image was more damning than the last. Caroline's face turned ashen as she stared at the evidence, her hands trembling. "Greg, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No more lies, Caroline. I know about you and Arthur. I know about the emails, the calls, the hotels. I know this has been going on for years." Her mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words. Finally, she leaned back, exhaling shakily. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Greg's eyes narrowed. "How was it supposed to happen, Caroline? You've been lying to me, to the kids, for years. Were you ever planning on telling me the truth?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked away. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Greg's voice hardened. "You've been living a double life, cheating on me and lying about everything, even the kids." Caroline's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "What do you mean?" "I had DNA tests done," Greg said, his voice heavy with emotion. "None of them are mine." Her face crumpled as she buried it in her hands. "Greg, please, I can explain." "Then start explaining," he said coldly. "How long has this been going on? How many lies have you told?" Caroline hesitated before finally admitting, "It started with Arthur, but he wasn't the first. There were others. I don't know why. I just felt so lonely." Greg's jaw clenched. "Lonely? I've worked tirelessly to provide for this family, to make sure you and the kids had everything you needed. And your solution was to cheat. You were never home," Caroline snapped, her tone defensive. "You were always at work, always busy. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." Greg's frustration boiled over. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to sleep with other men? You destroyed our family because you couldn't be honest." Caroline's tears flowed freely, but her expression was defiant. "You think this is all on me? You're not perfect, Greg. You ignored me for years. You chose your career over us. Don't you dare put this on me," Greg said, his voice low and dangerous. "I worked hard for us, For the life we built. I didn't abandon our marriage. You did. The room fell silent, the weight of their argument suffocating. Caroline wiped her tears, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I made mistakes, but I still love you. Greg let out a bitter laugh. Love. You don't destroy someone you love. You don't lie to them every day for years. Reaching for his hand, Caroline pleaded, Greg, please. We can fix this. For the kids. His eyes burned with a mix of fury and sorrow. The kids? The ones you've lied to their entire lives? You've already taken so much from me. Don't use them to excuse what you've done. Caroline's sobs grew louder, but Greg stood, his resolve unshaken. I'm done with your excuses. I'm done with the lies. You made your choices, Caroline. Now you'll have to live with them. As he walked away, Caroline's cries echoed behind him. For the first time in weeks, Greg felt a strange sense of clarity. The confrontation was over, but the battle for his family's future was just beginning. When Caroline stopped Greg in the hallway, her expression was uncharacteristically vulnerable. Greg, we need to talk. It's important. He sighed, setting down his keys. What now, Caroline? She hesitated, her eyes darting away before meeting his. I'm pregnant. The words hit Greg like a freight train. He stared at her, trying to process the revelation. You're what? Pregnant, she repeated softly, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. It's Arthur's. Greg's jaw tightened as his mind reeled. Arthur's, he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. So, on top of everything else, now you're expecting a child with the man who helped destroy our family? Caroline's voice wavered. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't plan this. Greg's laugh was bitter, his frustration bubbling over. Of course you didn't. Just like you didn't plan to lie for years or tear apart everything we built. The days that followed were a blur of tension and confusion. Greg couldn't ignore the possibility of her pregnancy, but trusting anything she said felt impossible. Doubt gnawed at him until he made a decision. Another DNA test was the only way forward. Weeks later, the results arrived. Greg sat at the kitchen table, the envelope trembling in his hands. He tore it open, scanning the document with growing disbelief. The baby wasn't Arthur's, but it wasn't his either. Caroline walked in moments later, her face cautious. You got the results? Greg held up the paper, his expression unreadable. It's not Arthur's, he said flatly, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes widened in shock, and she stumbled backward slightly. What? That can't be right. Right? Greg repeated, his voice rising. Caroline, do you even know who the father is? Or have there been so many lies, you've lost track? Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. I thought it was Arthur. I didn't think... Of course you didn't think, Greg snapped, his voice sharp with anger. You've spent years destroying this family with your selfishness, and now you've brought an innocent child into the mess you've created. Caroline buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, but Greg felt no sympathy. This time, her betrayal had gone too far. He was done being her emotional crutch. You're on your own with this, Greg said coldly, standing up. Figure it out, but don't expect me to clean up your mess. As he walked away, leaving Caroline to her despair, Greg felt a grim sense of resolution. The betrayal had cut deeper than he'd thought possible, but it also solidified his resolve to rebuild his life without her lies, manipulation, or chaos. This time, he was moving forward for himself and his children, no matter how tangled the past had been. The consequences of Caroline's actions began unraveling faster than she could manage. After the disastrous company party, whispers turned into investigations, and investigations into formal allegations. Arthur, desperate to save himself, implicated Caroline in a series of financial irregularities within the company. The fallout was swift. One morning, as Greg sat in the kitchen, scrolling through the news, a headline caught his eye. Corporate scandal unfolds. Executives under investigation for fraud. Caroline's name was prominently mentioned alongside Arthur's. The article detailed misappropriated funds and questionable accounting practices, all uncovered following a whistleblower complaint. Greg couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. She had built her life on lies and deceit, and now everything was crumbling around her. Caroline returned home that afternoon, her face pale and her movements frantic. Greg, I need to talk to you, she said, her voice trembling. He looked up from his coffee, his expression neutral. What now? They fired me, she admitted, her eyes welling with tears. And they're pressing charges. They think I was involved in the fraud. Greg set his mug down, leaning back in his chair. Were you? Caroline's breath hitched. I didn't know everything Arthur was doing, but I signed off on some things without questioning them. I didn't think it would come back to me. Greg's stare was icy. So once again, you didn't think. That seems to be a recurring theme with you. She collapsed into the chair across from him, tears spilling over. Greg, I'm in trouble. I could lose everything. I need your help. Greg let out a bitter laugh. You need my help? After everything you've done to me? To our family? Her desperation grew. Greg, please. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But you know me. You know I'm not a bad person. He stood, towering over her. I thought I knew you, Caroline. Turns out I didn't. The woman I married wouldn't have betrayed her family, lied to her husband, or dragged her children into this mess. Caroline reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Greg, I'm begging you, for the kids' sake. That was the final straw. Greg's voice turned cold. Don't you dare use the kids to manipulate me. You've done enough damage to them. I won't let you drag them any further into your chaos. Her sobs echoed in the quiet house, but Greg felt nothing but detachment. He had spent years giving everything to a woman who had taken him for granted, and now she was reaping the consequences of her choices.